Friends who have drilled through the hole all know that the Kola Superdeep Borehole is the deepest hole ever dug by humans into the Earth's crust. However, few people know why the Soviet Union abruptly stopped drilling. According to official statements, it was due to the extreme difficulty of drilling and insufficient funding. However, there is another theory circulating online. It is said that when the depth reached over 12,000 meters, there suddenly came a horrifying wailing sound from within, as if from the depths of hell. This led people to believe that the Soviet Union had drilled into the gateway to hell, forcing them to halt the operation. However, this theory is only speculative and circulated on the internet. The horror movie based on the Kola Superdeep story may provide a more convincing narrative. The story takes place on the day before the permanent closure of the Kola Superdeep Borehole. Anya, a former Soviet biologist, is having dinner with her family when she receives a secret phone call from her superiors. They inform her that the exploration team at the Kola Superdeep Borehole, at a depth of 12,000 kilometers, has heard terrifying and unidentified screams. Over 20 members of the exploration team have mysteriously disappeared, and those who managed to escape have been infected with an unknown virus. To prevent a greater disaster, the higher-ups decided to completely seal off the Kola Superdeep Borehole within 24 hours. That's why they sought out Anya, hoping she could uncover what they had unearthed before the closure. The most important task was to retrieve samples of the virus. Time was of the essence, and the group immediately boarded a helicopter bound for the Kola Peninsula. Accompanying Anya were her superior, who had spoken to her on the phone, and an armed squad. However, as soon as they arrived at their destination, they sensed that something was amiss. The soldiers were highly tense, as if they had seen something terrifying. When the helicopter landed in the snow, they soon discovered the reason: the escapee from the drilling site, an infected individual. Keeping their guard up, the group remained on high alert as the infected individual approached. But in the next second, the infected person detonated the bomb in their hand. Fortunately, everyone was prepared and only sustained minor injuries. With her wits regained, Anya immediately approached the corpse and extracted tissue samples from the infected individual. However, to her surprise, within a few seconds, the tissue in the test tube turned white. Having worked in this field for over a decade, Anya had never witnessed such a phenomenon. Could it be that the change was caused by the host's death? To determine if the surviving workers had been infected, Anya extracted blood samples from them for testing. Fortunately, none of the workers showed any abnormalities. However, they all appeared tense and seemed to have witnessed something horrifying below. When Anya questioned them, they remained tight-lipped, only warning her that what lay below was more terrifying than hell itself and that she still had time to turn back. The more they discouraged her, the more determined Anya became to explore further. Soon, the group entered an elevator that led deep into the Earth's depths. This elevator was not a simple press-and-go mechanism. It required a keycard from the base supervisor along with a password to operate. The supervisor informed everyone that if the password was entered incorrectly 3 times, the elevator would plummet straight down. The safety measures were extremely high, considering the depth of the borehole. Additionally, due to the significant depth, the elevator descended at a rapid pace, covering several hundred meters in just a second. However, when the elevator reached the 2,000-meter mark, the supervisor suddenly pressed the pressure button and swiftly put on an oxygen mask. As a powerful rush of air filled the elevator, the others lost consciousness due to oxygen deprivation. The elevator eventually stopped at a depth of 6,000 meters, but the supervisor quickly removed the keycard and hurriedly left. When the others regained consciousness, they found themselves in a living area. However, their purpose for this journey was to reach the laboratory at 12,000 meters to investigate the truth and retrieve virus samples. Eyeglasses Guy informed the group that they would need to take another elevator to reach that depth, but it also required the supervisor's key to activate. So, the group began searching for the supervisor, but it seemed like he was deliberately avoiding them. They searched the entire living area but couldn't find any trace of him. They only encountered 2 remaining staff members who hadn't evacuated in time. To be cautious, Anya conducted blood tests on the 2 individuals to confirm they hadn't been infected. Once their safety was assured, the group resumed searching for the supervisor's whereabouts within the living area. Unexpectedly, the supervisor approached Anya at the elevator entrance. It turned out that the supervisor had intentionally been evading them because he didn't want them to venture into the 12,000-meter depth. He believed there was something terrifying down there that he couldn't let escape. He urgently urged Anya to leave with the group. However, Anya refused to listen and promptly called for reinforcements. Without hesitation, the arriving soldiers opened fire at the supervisor. who took cover and escaped into elevator 2, heading underground. With no elevator available now, their hopes of descending were shattered. However, the higher-ups were not ready to give up. In order to obtain the virus samples, they decided to send the soldiers on foot through the pathway to retrieve the key for the elevator at the 12,000-meter depth. Due to the scorching temperatures reaching up to 200 degrees Celsius, the soldiers needed to wear high-temperature protective suits. Without proper protection, they would be cooked alive within minutes. Just as the team was about to open the steel door and proceed, a surviving woman emerged from the pathway. Escaping from the 200-degree heat was something an ordinary person couldn't accomplish. Anya immediately examined the woman's body and discovered that she had indeed been infected with the mysterious virus. Her decaying back was covered in a dense layer of mold, a sight that sent shivers down anyone's spine. However, the woman seemed to feel no pain. Anya quickly took a small sample for testing and found that the mold grew at an extremely rapid rate. It was a type of fungus she had never seen before. It parasitized its host, extracting nutrients from them and posing a risk of transmission. Yet, at that moment, Anya was unaware that being infected with this mold would lead to even more terrifying consequences. Soon, the woman in the laboratory began to exhibit abnormal behavior. Her fingers twisted involuntarily, and her body uncontrollably crashed into the glass. Meanwhile, the team that had reached the underground area reported being attacked by unidentified creatures. At that moment, the broadcast suddenly played the supervisor's voice. He angrily informed everyone that since they had ignored his warning to leave earlier, now nobody would be able to escape. Before anyone could react, a massive explosion rocked the living area. The supervisor had detonated the pressure pump to prevent the mold from spreading outside. In 1 hour, they would be crushed like soda cans. Fortunately, their objective had already been achieved, and now they had to make it back to the surface with the infected individual through the pathway. However, when Anya and the colonel arrived at the laboratory, they witnessed an incredibly horrifying scene. The entire lab was overrun with mold, and the floor was covered in a sticky substance. The infected woman's body had been consumed entirely by the mold. Only her head remained, but she still retained consciousness. Just as the two were preparing to collect mold samples, the spores suddenly emitted a large amount of green powder, directly spraying onto the colonel's face. Anya quickly put on a gas mask and, with the help of her teammate, managed to escape the immediate danger. However, the colonel had been infected by the mold. Recalling how the samples they collected on the ground turned white, Anya quickly reached a conclusion: the mold couldn't survive in cold environments. With a tube of the sample in hand, Anya led her superior to the freezing chamber, intending to prove her hypothesis. As expected, when the sample was exposed to the cold environment, it immediately turned into white powder. This explained why the mold preferred to parasitize human bodies. Now, Anya started to worry. Taking the virus samples outside would undoubtedly trigger a catastrophic disaster. However, upon hearing this, her superior had no intention of giving up. They still decided to take the colonel, infected with the mold, out for further research. As a subordinate, Anya couldn't say much in opposition. They had originally planned to wear protective suits and ascend through the pathway. However, as soon as they opened the steel door, another figure appeared from within. To their astonishment, it was one of the team members who had gone down earlier, but his arm was severed. Terrifying roars could be heard from behind him, as if some creature was rapidly approaching. Before anyone could react, the desperate team member used a knife to slit his own throat. In a panic, they quickly closed the steel door, but the next moment, the monster relentlessly began slamming against it. The group immediately fled towards the living area, with the monster about to break through the passage door and the elevator unavailable for use. It meant they were completely trapped. However, just as everyone felt helpless, the doors of elevator 2 suddenly opened, although they didn't have the key. Fortunately, there was a maintenance worker among them who could make the elevator free fall. Risking being fatally thrown, they boarded the elevator and descended to the deepest point, 12,000 kilometers below. Now, the only way to leave this place safely is to go down and retrieve the supervisor's key. As they were about to reach their destination, Anya urgently pulled the emergency brake, bringing the elevator to a steady stop. However, upon opening the elevator doors, they discovered an unusually cold environment. The entire laboratory was frozen, and there was no sign of the supervisor. The man with glasses pressed the recorder, and a recording left by the supervisor played. He explained that this mold was an ancient fungus that had been permanently buried in the permafrost underground, but they had inadvertently unearthed it. Not only could this mold control human muscles and nerves, but it could also fuse their bodies together. Therefore, he had lowered the laboratory's temperature to the lowest possible level to freeze the infected researchers in place. In the final moments before his death, the supervisor expressed his desire to witness the true form of the mold. Realizing that the supervisor was most likely outside, they decided to go out and retrieve the elevator key. However, the outside temperature was a scorching 200 degrees, and even with protective suits, they could only endure a few minutes. Anya initially intended to go outside wearing a protective suit, but to her surprise, her superior stepped forward voluntarily. At this point, he had no intention of taking the virus samples outside. Perhaps it was the recording left by the supervisor that made him change his mind. However, more than 10 minutes had passed, and there was still no sign of the superior's return. Anya put on her protective mask and resolutely rushed outside. Not far from the corridor, Anya saw the body of her superior. She managed to retrieve the key from him, and on the wall ahead, there was a radiant red light emanating from it. Clearly, that was the true form of the mold. If a mold of this scale were to spread outside, the entire human world would be wiped out. It had to be contained here. Without further delay, the remaining 3 individuals quickly activated the elevator and hurriedly returned to the living area. However, as soon as they stepped out of the elevator, the man with glasses was attacked by a monster. Taking advantage of the chaos, Anya escaped to the freezing chamber, took a sip of strong alcohol to calm her nerves, and poured a bucket of ice-cold water over herself to lower her body temperature. She successfully slipped away from the monster unnoticed. Shortly after, she found the maintenance worker who had gotten separated earlier. Supporting each other, they finally reached the number 1 elevator that led to the surface. They managed to close the elevator doors just before the monster caught up to them. However, as they caught their breath inside the elevator, they discovered a colonel who had been infected by the mold. He had already been tortured to the point of being unrecognizable, and mold spores were spewing from his mouth. This indicated that Anya and the maintenance worker had also been infected. In order to prevent the mold from spreading to the surface, Anya decisively pulled out the key, but the maintenance worker, who had fought so hard to escape, refused to comply. He wanted to survive, so he snatched the key from Anya's hand. He restarted the elevator, and to prevent Anya from stopping him again, the maintenance worker was prepared to kill her. At the critical moment, with his right hand reduced to mere bones, the colonel stabbed the maintenance worker to death. Realizing that the elevator would plummet if the wrong password was entered 3 times, Anya, enduring her impending mutation, deliberately entered the wrong password. As there was only 1 attempt left to enter the password, an exhausted Anya collapsed, losing consciousness. As soon as the elevator reached the ground floor, 2 individuals wearing protective suits dragged the dazed Anya out. However, just before that, she successfully entered the wrong password for the last time, causing the elevator to plummet. Yet, the mold still resided within her body. In that moment, Anya finally understood why the initial staff member chose to self-destruct. Like herself, he was also trying to prevent the mold from spreading to the outside world. Now, Anya had no choice but to make the same decision. Taking advantage of the distracted soldiers, she snatched a hand grenade. In front of the watching eyes, she chose to self-destruct as well.